I'm very happy to be here. And you're absolutely right that London seems to be much emptier than usual, and a lot of us have left. And I was just saying that I'm in France at the moment, so we will return one day, I guess. But I'm very happy to be here. I'm very delighted to be speaking on this topic today. Let me share my screen so that you can see my presentation. There you go. So what I wanted to talk to you today is about policy resilience in a crisis and whether data science can help. And we've been giving a lot of thought to this within the Alan Turing Institute. And this is what I'm presenting today. This is joint work with Professor Helen Marget at the University of Oxford and Professor Ben MacArthur at the University of Southampton. So here's the plan for today. I would like to give you an introduction to the Alan Turing Institute, to those who are not familiar with it, because I do think that it provides a very good model for how government could access data science expertise. We'll talk then briefly about what data science can do for policymakers. I'll spend a fair bit of time talking about why we haven't seen these technologies used more in the current crisis and what that says about policy resilience. And then I'll give some recommendations for a more resilient future. So please interrupt me if you have any questions. It's always nice to hear another voice. Please feel free to speak up and stop me if anything is unclear. So here's the Alan Turing Institute. It's the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, and it brings together 13 partner universities from Cambridge, Oxford, and UCL to Manchester, Newcastle, and Southampton. What's great about the Institute is that it gives us access to unequal access to expertise in these domains. So we have about 400 academics from these universities, whom we call Turing Fellows, who are affiliated with the Institute. We have about 70 Turing-based researchers, over 45 PhD students, more than 100 visiting researchers. So we have a very large community of specialists in data science and AI at the Institute. In May 2018, we launched the Public Policy Research Program, and the idea behind it is to help governments take advantage of the latest generation of data-intensive technologies. When we set up the program, we had hundreds of meetings with policymakers to understand what would make their lives easier and how we would be able to help them. And we identified 4 areas of opportunity. 2 of them are on the technical side, so use data science and AI to inform policymaking and the provision of public services. And 2 of them are on the sort of ethical and regulatory sides. How do you build the ethical foundations for the use of these technologies in the public sector? And also, how do you contribute to policy that governs the use of data science and AI in the wild, as it were? Our job is to link the government to the Institute's community of hundreds of data scientists and AI researchers. More than 70 public sector organizations have reached out to us for help thus far. And we're quite a big sort of endeavor at the moment. We set up and oversee more than 30 research programs involving more than 70 researchers from 10 universities. And we've conducted hundreds of thousands of hours of work for the public sector. Now, the reason why this is a successful model in the UK is that the government basically has a one-stop shop where they can come and ask for advice on data science and AI. And I think that's a fairly good model for countries as they're thinking about, how can they set up this, how can they set up data science and AI for the public sector. Cool, so that's us. And what do we spend our time thinking about? Well, we spend most of our time thinking about what data science and AI can do for policymakers. What I want to propose to you today is that data science and AI are a set of digital technologies that can help policymakers with some very specific tasks. One of them is simulation and evaluation. So one of the benefits of these technologies is that they can model complex systems. And by modeling complex systems, they allow us to run policy simulations. So we can understand the impact of a particular measure on these complex interconnected systems before they come into force. Techniques such as agent computing or network science are really behind a lot of the progress that we're seeing in the policy domain on the simulation and evaluation side. Measurement and detection, as policymakers, we always need to know the values of some indicators and to be able to detect where problems might arise, and machine learning can really help with that. Prediction and forecasting, we also need to have a way of understanding what the future holds, as imprecise as that understanding would be. And again, machine learning can help there. Personalization. So here, the idea is that we have so much data nowadays that as the public sector can get much better at personalizing the offerings that it has and the services that it provides using all of this complex data. And finally, ethics and governance, and a lot of thought has gone into the way we think about machine learning and AI and what the ethical implications of using these technologies are. Now, what's interesting is that in the middle of a pandemic, these tools can come in quite handy. So, for example, well-calibrated models of economy and health can allow us to measure and see the impact of various lockdown measures before they are imposed. They can also, machine learning technologies can help us detect health-related misinformation, which has been a huge problem in the current crisis. Prediction and forecasting can help us foresee where the next outbreak is going to be and intervene early. Personalization can help us with personalized treatment plans, and especially at the beginning of the pandemic when we knew so little about this disease, personalization is something that could have really helped in healthcare settings. And there were some very difficult questions being asked of doctors, such as when should someone be taken off a ventilator, for example. And machine learning was one of the technologies that people looked to try to answer some of these questions. On the ethics and governance side, I want to mention contact tracing apps, which raised a whole host of ethical issues that AI ethicists have been very well equipped to look at because they have been thinking about these issues for a while. When you read about contact tracing apps and the ethics of contact tracing apps in the news, you always see them presented as a trade-off between privacy and public health. But there are much, much bigger implications behind it, including the fact that this is a disease that tends to affect more the poor and the elderly, who are precisely the people who don't have very good access to mobile phones and contact tracing apps. So it's a field that equips us to ask those questions and move beyond sort of the obvious ones, such as privacy, the trade-offs between privacy and public health. Now, if these tools could have been so handy and so useful in the pandemic, the big question is, why have we not used them more? And what does that say about the resiliency of our policy systems? So in the category of why have we used them more, what I want to argue today is that COVID-19 has exposed a lack of resilience in policymaking systems. And this lack of resilience has three sources. One is data, one is models, and one is the structure and the values of government administration itself. So I'll start out by telling you and talking to you a little bit about the data. What we found during this crisis, and what has really limited our ability to use these technologies and to create more resilient policy, is the lack of real-time fine-grained data that can cross organizational boundaries. Now, why does real-time matter? Well, real-time matters because lack of timely data makes it impossible to calibrate calibrate policy. We've seen this at the beginning of the pandemic, for example. We didn't have data on new cases. Even nowadays in the UK, it is difficult to get data. There's a serious lag in the data of deaths, for example, which makes it difficult to know the extent of the pandemic. But I would argue that health data, actually, we've had a lot of health data. I'm an economist by trade, so we've had a ton of health data compared to the lack of economic data that we've had. And this partly relates to government's tendency to rely on official statistics for the creation and analysis of data. We don't know too much about the economy. We have to wait for a long time to understand what's happening to the various sectors. And that's a problem because it's impossible to design policy when you don't know what's happening in the real world. I would argue that we could know what's happening if governments chose to make better use of the huge troves of transactional data and administrative data that they have, but they're not doing so at the moment. Now, a consequence of lacking timely data is that time delays can introduce instabilities. And the best way I have of describing this is, we've all been in a shower where it takes a while to adjust the water, and you tend to over-adjust either on the hot, on the cold side if there's a large delay between when you're actually when the water temperature is responding to what you're adjusting. That's exactly what happens in a policy context as well. You can overshoot or undershoot depending on depending on the data that you have available at any one point. And instabilities in interconnecting systems can cascade. A small instability can give way to large instabilities in systems that are all interconnected. So that's the issue with the lack of real-time data that we have seen in this pandemic, and that has led to less resilience in policymaking. What's the problem with the lack of fine-grained data? Well, the problem with fine-grained data is that if we lack it, we cannot use data science and AI to build targeted interventions. And we have to rely on blanket policy measures. So I have two examples for you here. The initial lack, especially in the first stages of the pandemic, of spatial data, did not allow us to see where the outbreaks were emerging. And we had to rely on a very crude national lockdown measure. And arguably, we could have avoided that if we knew more about what was happening at a very fine-grained local level. On the economic side, the fact that we lack sectoral data also leads us to rely on national policies. And this goes back to Keynes, who argued for government stimulus at a time of crisis. Now, he was right to do that, but at the time that he was writing, he did not have the data or the models to be able to understand where that stimulus could go. And while he's right that having some stimulus is better than none, I think we've really evolved, and our technology has evolved over the past 2 years, allowing us to calculate where you should invest that stimulus. And blanket national policies are not the answer. So blanket national furlough scheme, for example, is not the answer. You can get much more out of that public investment if you can figure out where you should invest that money. Some sectors in this crisis have been affected much more than others. Yet, at least in the UK, we had the exact same government support provided to them. Fine-grained data would have allowed us to understand better where to target those policy interventions. Why was it a problem, and why did it make policy much less resilient, policy system much less resilient, the fact that data couldn't cross organizational boundaries? Well, it's because lessons get lost if data cannot cross organizational boundaries. And we're seeing it where we saw problems between national and local data transfers. So here, again, I can give you an example from the UK, where between June 13 and June 26, Leicester was convinced that they only had 80 new COVID cases, and these are the number of cases that they recorded. Now, the health secretary came out and he said that in fact, there were 944 new cases over this period in Leicester. But the local authorities in Leicester didn't have access to this data. So they thought that the scale of the pandemic was 8% of what it actually was. This led to delays, the fact that the local authorities did not have access to the national data, led to delays in addressing the pandemic and missed time and new lockdown measures. And we're also seeing that lessons get lost because data from one department cannot move to another department. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but the fact that departments are in charge of their own areas means that they usually can access data in their own domain and have difficulties accessing data in others and understanding how their policies in one domain affect policies in another. So those are three large issues on the data side that has made us much less resilient to this crisis and less able to take advantage of the latest generation of data-intensive technologies. Now, what about the modeling side? Well, the current models we found out during this pandemic, and we've also known about this if we've spent some time thinking about it over the past few years, but they have three main issues, I would say. They don't deal well with surprises, interconnectedness, and uncertainty. So let's start with surprises and what the issue there is. Well, we know that the vast majority of models don't work well with surprises. And we've seen this, for example, with negative oil prices. And this is, I'm an economist, and I know that we don't, our axes don't have negative numbers on them because we don't have negative prices. So we never code negative prices into our models. But during this pandemic, for a brief period of time, oil prices did go negative, and this caused huge problems for any model that had oil prices in them. The other thing that we're struggling with is that our current models rely on past history to understand the world today. Well, in light of a huge shock like COVID, past history doesn't tell you much. Just because it is unprecedented. We've heard this word used so much. So one of the big concerns at the moment, for example, is that the financial investment models that have parameters that are calibrated on the past do not do a very good job at advising you where to invest today, just because of all the changes that have happened. This adds instability in a country because besides the economic environment of uncertainty that you have and instability that you have, you also have those models working in the background, suggesting the wrong investments. They're no longer reliable in the way that they were prior to the pandemic. So this is an issue that we must fix. We must have models that adapt more easily and more seamlessly with reality. What about interconnectedness? Well, the models that we used during the pandemic failed to capture the interconnection between policy areas. And this is important because it has made policymaking much, again, less resilient, and it has allowed us, it has really limited our understanding of the policy, if of the effects of the various policy measures. What we've seen during the pandemic is a lot of epidemiological models, a ton of them. Some are modeling at larger scale, some are modeling very sort of small bits of the pandemic. What we've also seen is some socioeconomic models, not highly sophisticated and not nearly as many as the epidemiological models, but there are some socioeconomic models that are trying to get at the effects of the pandemic itself. Now, what we're missing and what's causing us a huge headache is the feedback loops in between them. The policies to reduce transmission of the disease feed into the economy and feed into socioeconomic models. And equally, the economy and policies to mitigate socioeconomic outcomes influence the epidemiological models. Because all of our models are separate and siloed, we're missing these feedback loops. And I think we would have been in a much better position to deal with the pandemic had we had these feedback loops built in, and had we been able to link the epidemiological models with the socioeconomic models to give us an integrated picture of the interconnection between the policy areas. A side effect of missing interconnections is that interconnections can predispose to cascades of failure. So here I'm just listing a picture of how electric power feeds into various components and draws from other areas of the of the world. Now, if any of these connections is broken, we have a cascade of failures just because of the interconnections and interdependencies between each one of these areas. And we are more predisposed to cascades of failure, particularly if response systems are siloed or do not match the interconnected nature of the world. Although this picture is sort of the electric power supply and the inputs and outputs from this, you can have a ton of similar pictures with that. And we've seen it again during the pandemic. Supply chain disruptions, for example, ended up to cascades of failure due to factories being closed in some countries and not being able to continue their supply. So the lesson to learn here is that we need to develop ways to connect knowledge domains and to allow for the efficient transfer of information between response structures. And I think this is where data science and AI can really help. So just to summarize, on the interconnectedness side, we had models that focus either on the health or the economy, but we didn't have linked models to understand the system as a whole. And we can predispose a system to a cascade of failures if we don't capture interconnectedness. The final thing that I want to say about models is that they also don't deal well with uncertainty. And all of the models that we see used in the policy space are rife with inputs and parameters that are not precisely known. Yet very few of those models resort to uncertainty quantification, which is really severely limiting the usefulness of these models in a public sector setting. So what about the last thing that I want to talk to you about is the structure of government administration and how this has led to a sort of lack of resilience as well. So what I want to tell you is that the ways in which governments are structured work against the successful adoption of data science and AI. And I'm not going to sort of tell you tell you like the whole story of why data science and AI struggle to sort of make their way into public administration, but just mention two particular ways. One of it is departmentalism, and here The issue is that government departments are often in competition with one another. So what you see in a lot of countries, well, in most countries really, is that you have a health department and the department focused on the economy, and one focused on social welfare or education, transport and energy, criminal justice, and so on. Now, each one of these departments receives funding from the Treasury, and everybody's fighting. It's a fight for resources. Everybody's fighting for their own resources, and in that fight, everybody needs to show how good they are and how much they're contributing. This leads to competition rather than collaboration between government departments. And this is an issue because technology transfer often happens within departments rather than across departments. So here you have an example from the UK, for example, from the UK, in which the policy area responsible for energy and industrial strategy wanted to write a machine learning system, to produce a machine learning system that can identify the people who are at risk of ending up in fuel poverty. Now, to create the system, they reached out to the team within their department that was looking at how we can identify, which startups have high growth potential. So they basically took this machine learning algorithm and tried to adapt it so they can identify vulnerable people. But this is a vastly different question. Adapting technology about startups to technology about vulnerable people is a huge step to make. We would argue that it would have been so much more efficient for the technology transfer to happen across departmental lines. The social welfare department had questions about identifying vulnerable people as well, so they can intervene early. The Department of Housing also had questions about it. And had these departments worked together rather than in competition with each other, there would have been greater methodological overlap, and they could have benefited from that. They would have avoided duplication, so answering the same question within various departments. And also they would have benefited from economies of scale from a centralized approach. So departmentalism is really limiting, is really working against the successful adoption of data science and AI, and leads to a competition between departments and a siloed approach. The other thing that's limiting the successful adoption of data science and AI is this idea that the values on which we must base government administration are lean and purposeful. And by choosing these values, we are prioritizing efficiency and parsimony and minimization of costs. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because of the way in which governments think about AI. This is a definition of AI by Minsky. You hear it quoted a lot, and it basically says that artificial intelligence is the science of making computers do things that require intelligence when done by humans. What we're trained to think about artificial intelligence as something that can do what humans can do. And this is a definition that appeals to governments a lot, especially to governments that are focused on efficiency. So we're seeing policymakers turn to AI to try to replace what humans are doing. So we see local authorities, for example, that are in the UK, that are strapped for cash at the end of years of austerity, wanting to turn to machine learning algorithms to see if these algorithms can identify children at risk and replace social workers in the process. But the advantage of using data science and AI does not come from replacing what humans can do. It comes from applying these technologies so they can do things that humans cannot do, which is model the interconnectedness within the systems, have a better understanding of interconnected and interdependent areas. So I think that this focus on sort of efficiency and replacing humans with these technologies is wrong. And it can really limit what AI can do for government. And we have to think about how data science and AI can do things that we cannot do, which is analyze huge amounts of information in a way that we could not possibly do. So what would be our recommendations for a more resilient future? What could we fix to make sure that data science and AI can be used to create a more resilient future? Well, the first one would be to use data science to do what humans cannot do. This is where we can really gain. And I think linking the areas of knowledge and the areas of policies and linking models like the epidemiological and the economic models would really make for a more resilient policy system. Making sure that the right data are available. We can't turn to these technologies if we don't have the data to feed into them. Build integrative models. This is the idea that I said earlier. Siloed models and siloed approaches do not work in this interconnected world. Prioritize uncertainty quantification. This is crucial. When I see policy done using Excel models with not even a confidence band around the estimate, it's really, that's a huge red light. And aim for targeted interventions. I think if we have this as our goal, to have targeted rather than blanket interventions, it would allow us to think how we can make use of these technologies better. A final word of warning before I end is don't take ethics out of a crisis. And this is usually the first thing to go when we're pressed for time. But I think it's crucial for public trust and for the future of these technologies to make sure that we use them responsibly. Now, I wanted to point you to a piece that we produced at the Turing on tackling COVID-19 through responsible AI innovation. It was published in the Harvard Data Science Review for those of you who are interested. And that's it from me. Happy to hear from you and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Cosmina. It was very, yes, give applause. So please unmute your microphones and just give a big applause to Cosmina. Okay. I don't know who was that. Very inspiring presentation. It was a very active chat. So we were just, while we were listening to you, we were reacting to your comments. So just, I'm going to wrap up a little because I guess that there are many questions, some of them even very provocative, but we are going to leave just to the people to calculate and calibrate the degree of provocation that we wanted to raise. So I think that the concept of policy resilience that you addressed from the early beginning is very, we've been discussing even DigiTranScope with Max and Henk and Marina and Giri about in light of the COVID aftermath in many countries, how this policy resilience look like. So, and I think it's very good framework in order to understand how different governments are dealing with data and with the tools and models and so on and so forth. Then the second point that I would like to highlight is something that you mentioned, that not all the policy analysis underline, and it's the fact of the inequalities. And how, and you mentioned many times the vulnerabilities, and I think it's very clear and it's very key issue. And it reminds me of resonates with the Ewang's book of Automating Inequalities. That is, for us at least, it's just this kind of book that is like a very present in our research in the JRC. Then the third point that Max also addressed in the chat is the relevance of fine-grained data. Yesterday we had a presentation of a colleague of us, because in the JRC, in DigiTranScope, in the group, in the team, we are working also on that. So there are a lot of linkages between, so it's very clear. And then the fourth point, it was a big discussion when you mentioned Leicester as a case. I think it's very key question. I was even following up this question. I have some friends in Leicester, in England. And that brings us to the debate about how we can improve the the coordination between departments, but I also included something that I mentioned last days. You mentioned that there is no coordination or there is not evolution of data from the national government to the regional government to the local. And it's something that I address as data devolution. So there is no, I mean, at least you have mentioned, but in many countries in Europe, I would say that is even not in the agenda. And then we have seen that this is very much provoking a lot of hindrances and drawbacks. And the last point, not less important, that there was some reaction in the chat, and it's maybe where I'm going to open the floor for discussion, and Henk is laughing because he was the one as a lead scientist of our project of models. Models between how different, I mean, you are economists, some of us are sociologists, there are some, could be even some epidemiologists, even there are some urban geographers, political geographers, political scientists. This debate, and I think in many, at least I have mentioned that something that I'm missing in the debate about COVID-19, about models, is that sometimes social sciences, it is not the case in the UK, but I would say it's the case, for example, in Spain. There is a big discussion at the moment that there are no social scientists in the National Committee of Experts giving advice to the president. So that, I think that there are many, many aspects that we can talk about, but I open the floor for questions. Please, Henk, please, Max, and please, the rest of the people, particularly PhD students, that they are without the video. So please don't hesitate and don't be shy.
No, but I definitely agree with you on the sort of lack of social scientists. And even within the UK, we have been we have been arguing this repeatedly. That initially the focus was all on health and epidemiological knowledge and expertise. But one of the things that we kept pointing out even at the beginning, when people are saying all we need is lockdown measures, well, a lockdown measure is a behavioral thing. You cannot, although they might influence the course of the disease, you're working with people and you're telling them to change their behavior in crucial ways. And the area that studies behavior is the social sciences. And you cannot do it without asking people, how are people going to react to this? And, how are you going to study their behavior and influence their behavior in a way that you want?
Indeed, yes.
Yes, and also, yeah, happy to take any questions.
Yeah, he's waiting. I don't want to monopolize. I'm the chair, but I'm looking at my senior colleagues.
And I was making, Cosmina, I was making, I was in a way kind of giggling in one way and reflecting rather sadly on the other hand that we have this amazing progress in technology, in huge availability of data. Things have gone on so dramatically, and yet you would go back to the same old issues about departmentalism, which has been the curse of bureaucracies forever, and sort of anybody who wants to be decisive in governments decries this departmentalism. So let's create some agency that will do away with the bureaucracy, and of course then you get up with hundreds of agencies who speak to each other, and sort of these questions that are all about organizational cultures and competition and power between organizations or departments within the same organization. And that's what we always fail to acknowledge, that we think that open data, open government, more data, more technology will solve these problems, but they don't. And we consistently fail to recognize the power of power, so if you want to put it that way. But I thought that maybe we could also ask Stephen, who is
yes,
senior in the Dutch government, in the Ministry of Interior, to just contrast what you said with the Dutch experience. But he also made a very interesting comment about that it's not just about competition between departments, but also the competition of rationalities. So Stephen, can you maybe sort of comment or ask a question to Cosmina, or how do you?
Yes, well, first of all, Cosmina, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very inspiring for me. I just mentioned in the chat, as Max already said, that in my experience, it's also a clash of rationalities. And in the Netherlands, we also saw that the medicine men were taking over. And the good news, at least in the Netherlands, was that there was a renewed interest in scientific knowledge, which is, by the way, being taken away as fast as it occurred. So the system fights back, as I always say. And in my experience, during a crisis, there's also the narrowing of consciousness, which is a very logical thing during a crisis, that you simply can't cope with all the complexity that you face. So go back to a quite simplistic way of managing in a one-to-one mode. And I was long working in policy execution within government. And later on, I decided to go into policy making. And being in policy execution, my frustration always was that nobody even seemed to remember that there was something like policy execution. So the decisions were made by people who had no clue about execution of policies whatsoever. And then I became a policymaker myself, and then I really experienced the stress during a crisis, that you just do it with the people who are at hand, and you simply forget to rely on information, on experts, etc., etc. So that's what I would like to add.
No, and I think they're very, very good points. And this is something that we've given thought to as well, that, you know, there wasn't, you're seeing this in a lot of countries, you know, these policy decisions have been made with no thought being given to the implementation and whether they can actually be put in practice. So sort of, you know, the operational aspect of it was missing. We are seeing sort of an emergence of governments leaning on scientific expertise, and we're seeing a lot of this idea of, you know, let's go back to the science. But the problem with science is the same problem, is that we have the same departmentalism in science that we have in government. So you can reach out to a health expert or to an economic expert or to a whatever, but they are specialized in their one little area, and they also do not know the interconnections between them. So that's why, in a way, I think the solution to this might be, I mean, this is, we're trying to do this at the Turing, and I can tell you probably in 2 years' time whether this is successful or not. But we've just gotten, we're getting this large research project off the ground in shocks and resilience. And the idea behind it is precisely this, to build some generalized models for policy, in which we're trying to sort of connect these areas of knowledge. Now, if you can have that, if scientists can have you know, greater insight into what the actual and real world effects of their policies or their proposals are, and if governments can see it, my hope is that, you know, you're no longer thinking my area is just health, you know, and the only thing I should be focusing on is, you know, how I can reduce transmission, and that's all I should be doing. Whether it's going to work or not, I don't know. We're getting epidemiological postdoctoral researchers. We're getting you know, socioeconomic researchers, and we're getting spatial modelers involved. What's going to come out of this? Yeah, you know, as I said, let's have another chat in 2 years and see if this is the solution. But I can't think of another one. I don't know how else to solve it.
But at least I was quite jealous when you explained the Turing Institute as such, being the one-stop shop for policy making, at least as far as data science and AI are concerned. I think that's a very useful step. But at the same time, we have this institute in the Netherlands that was quite central in the COVID crisis. And even within that institute, the silos were still working. And that's why I say it's not just about organizing, it's about culture, and it's indeed about rationalities, about the way you look to the world. And well, that's the beauty, by the way, of this whole week, and indeed of the whole project that we've been doing over the last few years. It's a permanent clash of rationalities. And that's really beautiful.
Sorry for, because I think that the chat is producing much more interesting comments. So just let's add another. I mean, I would just, while you were talking, Steven, thank you very much for your intervention. I mean, your experience is very, very valuable in this context, because we have our theoretical idea, or maybe it's our experience, our professional experience, but not as yours, you know. But the point is that, let me tell you that, at least for me, we need two things. We need political leadership, having a very strategic view that is not focusing on one department, but then we need expert scientists, officers, that they work interdisciplinarily into the organizations. And sometimes both things, they don't go together. Sometimes we don't have neither one nor the other. And when we have one, we don't have the other. So I think that these two things is very weird kind of context in which we can find in any institution. However, just adding another kind of layer, because we are talking inside the bubble of the bureaucratical bubble, Leviathan, okay? But there is a good question by Alberto from Alcalá de Henares about the proxy between the public institutions and outside, I mean, citizenship. So please, Alberto, take the floor and open directly to Cosmina. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting presentation, Cosmina, absolutely. I am also an economist and trying to... Yeah, I know.
He's laughing because he has a question for economists.
Okay, good enough. I'm not an economist. I was an economist. Anyway,
hold it against
I am
improved. You're improved.
I don't know what I did, right? Okay. Anyway, I am also using or trying to use novel methodologies to understand this dynamism, and I have already commented that I am using agent-based models and simulations to see the reactions, or the virtual reactions, and most of it the emergent phenomena within public organizations. Now, to make this short, I am studying the interaction between governments and citizenry and other stakeholders to understand how to collaborate, to co-create value for the public sector. And there's a disconnection, evident disconnection between citizenry and their solutions that could be, I don't know, got from hackathons and other collaborative events. And the impact of that in the, say, for example, innovation of the organization, of the public organizations. It is true that there's silos between the departments and the areas, and that is, I believe, a survival strategy that they have from ever, and probably every bureaucracy knows that their silos is sort of a way of protecting themselves against changes, like, for example, every office term that happens in our democracies. And but there is another silo, and that was my question, which is public organizations block any contact with citizenry except for a very limited number of reasons. And there is no a proper flow of communication or interactions, name it as you wish, between the two. So the same silos that you have seen and you have reflected in your presentation between the organizations or within the organizations happens with the external world, which sort of is like hindering the idea of a system, of a complex system, which is in the end an organization as complex as the public organization. I hope that make some thoughts for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I agree. I mean, it's a great point to make, and I think we're starting to give thought within the Turing as to how to get how to build a sort of like closer connection between the citizens and the public sector administrations in a way that would influence the way those technologies are used, for example. One research project that we're just getting off the ground now is we're going to be working with Camden City Council to build a citizens data charter, for example. And this is for the first time that we're basically bringing together the citizens from one from one local authority to see what ideas, to sort of like educate them on these technologies and the impact of those technologies, and to give them a say into how their data is going to be used. How do they want their data to be used for the services that they're going to be receiving? Again, I feel like I keep, it's the person who tells jokes and tells you the punchline is going to come in 2 years' time, but again, it's another project that we're just getting started now, and we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I welcome any thoughts in this area, because we don't have the answer to it. But what I do know, and I know from sort of citizen juries that we've run, and is when you educate the public on these technologies, they come up with brilliant ideas of how they should and shouldn't be used. And if we find a way to make sure that they have a bigger say in this, I think we'll end up in a much better place.
Right, and the Green Deal goal is all about collaboration and participation and deliberation. Whether you're speaking of the top most advanced technologies, or just a deliberation for a service in a local city, small city. So anyway, I'll be happy to share with you too. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you very much. Any other question? Because we have just 1 minute before we are going to move on to the next slot. Hank.
To explain my brutal comments, because I was not polite, as I told already to Igor. But I was so surprised that you were telling that models doesn't like surprises. And the reason I was so surprised is I'm living in the same room for more than 30 years with Peter Nijkamp at the university. He's a regional economist. And I'm always wondering, because I have the feeling, being a part of the faculty of economy, that the economist can model everything. And that's also what was part of your story. At least that's the feeling I got, that it's possible to model things we do not understand. And of course, we expect that at a certain moment, with the right data, artificial intelligence will help us. But in this case, with this pandemic, I mean, all the medical people had no clue what was happening. The epidemiologists were completely flabbergasted. It was a big surprise, a huge surprise. It was the explanation of the pandemic that we were not prepared and we did not understood what was happening. So a model without surprises, I don't know. But separate from that, I really enjoyed your overview, and I was really happy listening to you and to see how you have given us the overview of what's happening today in the real world.
Thank you very much.
I mean, yeah, I think I was referring more to, the surprises, and models' abilities to deal with them are also due to the way we structure the models, right? So,
yeah, but when you don't have the knowledge, you cannot structure it. I mean, this was something which was completely unknown for 99% of us. So we completely surprised. And then it's not possible to model it when you don't have the knowledge. you're not able to model it. And even AI cannot help us because we have not the right data for doing it.
Well, absolutely. I'm not saying that we could have predicted COVID.
No.
What I'm saying is that we could have had models, for example, that could have dealt with negative oil prices.
Oh, yes.
That's a coding thing, right? I'm saying, you know, that's
No,
a surprise that wasn't in the model because we only had positive prices in the model. And also, I think there are ways to update parameters, because at the moment we're using last year's parameters to model what's going to happen in the world today. But surely there has to be a way in which we can adapt those parameters much more quickly than that. So we don't rely on you know, sort of like past calibrations to understand what's happening today, because that's completely useless. That was the point that I was making.
On that. I mean, time is of the essence, and time has to be in the data, because otherwise we are too late.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the interaction between models. I think that at the end, Hank has jumped in. I was pushing him all the time. So having data, we need to do something with data. So I think we need to talk about data governance in the next slot. So please, Max, could you just connect with the next one?
Yes, thank you very much again, Cosmina. It has been a great pleasure to have you with us. And if you have the time and you want to stay a little bit longer, that's fantastic. But again, a big round of applause for you. It has been a great pleasure. And I think now I can stop this recording.